Oregon football goes into a matchup with number 12 BYU tomorrow as the favorite up at Autzen Stadium. And that might be overvaluing Oregon a bit, but there's one reason and one reason only why Oregon is opening as the favorite here. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thanks for making this your first listen or your first view if you're watching on YouTube of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Like, comment, and subscribe wherever you are listening to or watching the show. Thank you to everybody out there who recently got us to 1,000 subs on the YouTube channel. Keep them coming and continue to do so as I continue to grow the show and continue to be ever more grateful for all of your support. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has covered the season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. I'm kind of surprised Oregon's favored in this game. It makes me a little bit encouraged because Vegas always knows. Anytime you look at a line and you say, wow, why is that this? That's really surprising. Vegas tends to know things. But the reason that I still think they're being overvalued in the betting markets right now and by odds makers is that I don't really know what Oregon is. I've talked about it this week on the show. I still feel that way the day before the game. I don't really know what to make of Oregon so far. You look the way you're supposed to against Eastern Washington, an inferior opponent, and you look the way you were not supposed to against Georgia, a superior opponent. That leaves me with this middling kind of enigma sense of like what are the Ducks, right? What's their identity as a team? Is the defense going to make a leap forward? How's the defense going to look against a team that doesn't have NFL caliber receivers and a national championship winning quarterback? How's the offense going to look against a defense that is not Eastern Washington, which is an FCS opponent, but also is not Georgia, in which you have a team that is littered with NFL caliber guys who are going to be in the first or second round, right? Even after they lost all that talent. So I don't really know how to feel about them right now. And maybe it's just my lifelong nature as an Oregon fan to be cautious about certain things or cautious about feeling optimistic, right? Some people feel cautiously optimistic. I can be cautious about even being optimistic. The one reason Oregon is probably favored in this game is because it's in Eugene. If this game is a neutral site, I bet you it's BYU by a couple points maybe. And if it's in Provo, it's probably 3-4 the other way. I don't think this is a game where Oregon is going to be able to just run over their opponent, but I don't think it's a game where Oregon is outclassed either. And the biggest thing that you can't underestimate here when thinking about how to feel about this game is Dan Lanning and the staff are still relatively new. Now, they've had a couple games under their belt, so there's no excuse for them to come out and look sloppy and just not be able to execute or not make this a good competitive game the way it should be. Like on paper, this should be a great college football game. You got two well-known teams. You're playing in Eugene, so it'll be a great crowd. There are big ramifications on both sides. If BYU gets this win, then they're 3-0, and they could be sneaking into the top 10 potentially as they push towards a college football playoff berth for the first time in their school's history. Oregon, meanwhile, trying to get a win, jumpstart their season as they begin Pac-12 play. Like, there are major ramifications for what's going on here, and we should expect this to be as close a game as it is. I won't say I expect Oregon to win because I don't expect them to win, even though they're favored. I think that's them being overvalued a little bit because they're at home, but this is a BYU team that has got former Pac-12 players, has got an NFL caliber quarterback, and has got a coach who has been there for a few years, whereas Dan Lanning and company have not. And they've won a lot of football games. They were 5-0 against the Pac-12 a year ago. They're no strangers to going on the road and getting these sorts of victories across the Pac-12. They did it all of last year. And so when I look at this game and I'm trying to decide how I feel about it after having talked with Jake Hatch of Locked On BYU yesterday and just having thought about it and looked at the matchup all week, I don't feel strongly one way or the other. Like I think Oregon's overvalued at 3.5. Frankly, I wouldn't bet it because I don't know how to feel about this game in a strong way. I think it's going to be that good of a game, and it'll come down to something I talked about earlier in the week here on the show: execution. It's going to come down to execution in key moments. Who can protect the ball? Who can convert on third down? Who converts in the red zone? Scoring touchdowns rather than settling for field goals. I think just a couple of those sorts of situations, special teams could play large, right? Any of those sorts of tiny factors that people kind of overlook at times going into a game, right? Big picture, you think about how is Bo Nix going to play offensively? Who's going to be involved? How's the secondary going to perform? But I think this is a close enough matchup because Baylor's a good team, right? If that game is not played in Provo, BYU probably doesn't win, but still, they are on equal footing with Baylor. That's the reigning Big 12 champion and a team that can contend for a Power 5 conference championship in the Big 12 once again this year in the Baylor Bears with Dave Aranda as their coach. So BYU, at the very least, home or not, they're on equal footing as Baylor. But Oregon is a team that I felt coming into the year can get back to the Pac 12 championship game. And the Big 12, Pac 12, I think pretty comparable. Big 12, probably a touch above what the Pac 12 has from a conference depth perspective. But they're more comparable than, looking at the Big 10 or the SEC, right? Those are a class above everybody else. But the fact that BYU went toe to toe with that Baylor team and was able to keep their offense in check and, only put up 20 points, but it's a stingy Bears defense. I think it's a team that is really, really dangerous, but Oregon now gets a chance to show what they're capable of. That's the biggest opportunity that is presented here to Dan Lanning and company. Like, what do you got? Because if you come out in this game and you play them tight, but you lose on, I don't know, last second field goal or last second touchdown, something like that, then it's disappointing because you want to have the win. But it won't, I won't come on here and talk about how the sky is falling if Oregon loses a really tight game to a good team who's well coached and has a lot of talent and very experienced as well, like BYU. The sky would be falling if Oregon comes out and loses by, 10 or more points and it was kind of a 17-ish point game or whatever, and it's just not close. But on the flip side, Oregon has an opportunity to change everyone's perception of them. Because right now, I think people look at that Georgia game and think that's closer to what Oregon is actually going to be this year than Eastern Washington. Because, well, Eastern Washington is just so much of an inferior opponent than what we had against Georgia in the season opener. But if you come out, let's say Oregon wins this game by 2 touchdowns, I think that reinforces the idea that Oregon's a contender in the Pac 12 in 2022. In a major way. And if you wanted to bet anything like that, you'd go to Bet Online, your number one source for all your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. Find all the latest league developments, game matchups, news, and podcasts, including this week's games in the Pac-12 and beyond. BetOnline is also your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores, the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including Major League Baseball, go Mariners, even though they lost the other day, MMA, boxing, and golf, my personal favorite. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. It's a big opportunity for Oregon, and if they can win this game, it doesn't really matter how. Like, obviously, I just want them to win the game. It doesn't have to be by 10 or more points. You don't have to cover or anything like that. But if you find a way to win this game, even if it's tight and competitive, to me, that'd give me a lot of confidence. But I really do think it's going to come down to execution. And I've been harping on that all week. And I bet when we look back at this game, there will be just 1 or 2 plays that'll end up defining it. And it'll be because this team executed better than that team. And I don't have an inclination as to which one that's going to be because there's an element of randomness to, when college football teams are good in critical moments and when they are not. The well-coached ones tend to be better, but there's still, those moments where you say, boy, if this doesn't happen, that game maybe goes differently, right? Like 2009 Rose Bowl, LeGarrette Blount kicks the ball through the end zone for a touchback. It's kind of random, right? Ohio State didn't stumble in the red zone that game, and Oregon did, and that ends up being the difference. I think you could have a play like that, maybe not kicking it through the end zone, but for a running back, But you're going to have one of those plays in this game where we all look at it and go, yeah, that was the defining moment. I don't think there'll be any more than 3 where you say that was key. It could be a third down, it could be a red zone play, it could be a turnover, but I think there are going to be critical junctures in this game that define who comes out on top and how we feel about it on on Saturday night once the game wraps up. I had the chance to talk with Mark Rogers. He's the voice of college football on YouTube. We've had him on the show before. What does he think about the matchup and everything that it entails? Let's get to that conversation. And I'm joined now on the show by Mark Rogers. He is at Mark Rogers TV on Twitter. You can find him at the Voice of College Football on YouTube, talking about a little bit of everybody across the college football landscape. We've had him on before, and glad to have you back on the show, Mark.
Great to be here. Can't wait to talk some college football.
Yeah, that's kind of the name of your game, right? Voice of college football, that seems to be right up your wheelhouse. And we've got
the subject tends to come up from time to time.
yeah, just every now and then, casual water cooler conversation and whatnot. But let's talk about this Oregon BYU game. And first, I started the show saying today I think Oregon in the betting market sense is being a little overvalued right now. They have a 20-game home winning streak heading into the showdown with the Cougars tomorrow, but Oregon favored by 3.5. I just feel like they're the biggest enigma of the two teams right now. I have a better sense of what BYU is, having taken on South Florida and Baylor, than Oregon with the blowout against Georgia and then the blowout of Eastern Washington. This is a barometer game for me when talking about the Ducks. Do you think that that's appropriate? Is that how you feel about Oregon going into this game?
Well, I know that Autzen Stadium can be overwhelming. It's one of the better home field advantages in college football. So check that off as a big plus for Oregon to try to get its mind right, its emotions right, its confidence back after taking a beating 2 weeks ago. And regardless of what happened against Eastern Washington, we can kind of gauge that regardless of what the score was going to be there, that Oregon they need success against a big opponent to, again, get back to where they're going to be right for a Pac-12 run. So I believe that the line opened at 6.5. I saw 6.5 in Oregon's favor.
Whoa.
If my sources are correct, and the site that I like to tap, that it was boom 6.5 out of the gate, dropped quickly to 3.5. And you know what? I tend to I tend to be hopefully the voice of reason, because we tend to overreact, me included. The emotions tend to overreact to look at Oregon against Georgia, and we know Georgia's amazing, but still, who else is going to get blown out 49-3? That should be a factor in a conference race across America. So maybe Oregon's really not that good. And then, of course, we saw BYU take a Baylor team that many of us are expecting to challenge heavily for Big 12 title and a playoff spot, to a win in overtime without its two best wide receiver weapons. So that would seem to lead us toward, BYU winning this game. And obviously BYU having success against the Pac-12 and historically performing well against the Pac-12. But I don't think it's that simple. I expect bounce back from Oregon. I expect potential, not predicting it necessarily, but potential letdown from BYU after an enormous win at home, storm the field, emotions spent, overtime game, and now having to play a difficult opponent for a second consecutive game.
You make a good point that there is something to be said about playing in front of a raucous home crowd, and now you're going to be going into the exact opposite environment where every big play is a cheer of tens of thousands of fans, but in the other direction. And the emotional capital that BYU had to spend to win that game, I think also can't be overlooked necessarily. The reason I feel Oregon is being a little overvalued there, and if I were betting, I think I'd go BYU and the points. And not that I don't think Oregon can win; they certainly can. But I just think this is such a tight game. If you get over a field goal, I feel like it would be on whichever side is getting the points there. But the reason I feel that way about Oregon is that there just haven't been any indications that the Ducks are the sort of team we expected them to be coming into the season. They still could be. They still could very easily be a 9 to 10 win team in the regular season. But so far, they're yet to prove that. And BYU, what they have going for them is the confidence that they know they can compete with a top tier Power 5 program like Baylor and go on the field and get it done. It's different on the road versus at home, but that's just much more of a known commodity to me.
Yeah, there are also some certain aspects of Oregon's woes or any team's woes against two ends of the spectrum, meaning they play Georgia one week, then they play Eastern Washington, and okay, they fixed a lot of things, but is that just the opponent? And I did not see one play against Eastern Washington to be able to evaluate, because I think some of those things are impossible to evaluate because it's just more speed, better line play, all those things that we know to be true on the Georgia side that can't be equated to Eastern Washington. You know, if a running back's got a gaping hole that he didn't have the prior game, then shoot, we can all run through it for 15 yards before we get touched, as opposed to running into a brick wall against Georgia. But, you know, in the passing game, maybe some routes were open. Maybe Bo Nix hit some guys on stride that were similar to the Georgia game, in which, you know, the timing wasn't there. And so maybe they've worked some things out. And if Dan Lanning knows what he's doing, they are working things out, and should be a much improved team over what we saw in week one. That was just the perfect storm against Oregon. First year head coach, new personnel, new quarterback, and you got to face a wrecking crew of a defense.
Yeah, and a wrecking crew of a football team, frankly, that's got NFL talent on both sides of the ball. What do you think a win would mean for Oregon in this game, specifically for Dan Lanning as he embarks on his tenure as Oregon's football coach?
Well, as I alluded to with my first response, I think the confidence factor is enormous here and the momentum going forward. You know, this is a program that's picked up quite a few strong commits just here in the last few weeks. As well, I notice from top 150 to 200 players. So obviously, those guys weren't discouraged by the opening game loss. But if we see a second performance, and nobody's going to predict that it's going to be of the catastrophic nature of the Georgia game, but if it's a bad loss, a two-score loss, or just a poor effort or poor performance against BYU, then justifiably or not, there are going to be questions about Dan Lanning, Dan Lanning's preparation for good teams, and especially when this game is at home. I think most people are expecting some level of bounce back, especially when the coaching staff sees what you saw on tape against Georgia, and so they should be extra prepared uh, for another good team.
Yeah, I agree that there's a little bit of added pressure on Oregon because they're at home, specifically on the coaching staff. Like, you got to have your guys ready. They were clearly not ready for Georgia. They moved the ball right for a couple drives, but other than that, they were schematically outmatched. And what I've observed going into this game is you've had two games now. And look, are you going to be as sharp in game 3 as you probably will be in game 11 of the season? No, probably not. But should you be at a level to where you should be able to win this game, or at least make it highly competitive, right? I mean, losing by 2 scores at home when you're a favorite, to me, would be a major disappointment and would have some red flags, at least for the 2022 season. I think longer term, it's tough to draw those sorts of conclusions at this point in time. But being at home, having had a couple of games under your belt, I think you got to be able to run at a high level to make this the sort of game that we all expect it to be. As Oregon looks at BYU, Mark, and what you know, having watched the Cougars this year, because you watch a little bit of everybody in college football, what sort of challenge do you think BYU presents that you think could be a tough matchup for Oregon?
Well, I think, of course, we all know that they're an older team. So
Yeah.
they're an older team. They're therefore experienced in other such ways. They don't seem to get rattled. They're poised. They're going to be focused. There's I just think a higher uh, propensity to be focused and not be phased by environments and so forth because of that experience, both a life experience and otherwise game experience. Um, didn't see a whole lot of the Baylor game. Tried to, but had a number of things going on. So again, I know that they were missing two weapons um, in terms of their two top receivers from last year. Um, don't know where they went to supplement that, but BYU is going to play a physical brand of football up front because again, it's a unique roster makeup that's similar to Utah in regards to where do they go for talent and how that manifests itself along the offensive and defensive lines.
I think you're going to see him try and run the ball more than Oregon's first two opponents. Georgia, ran it, I think, more as the game went on, but came out with a very pass-centric attack. And Eastern Washington, kind of the same, because that's what the Eagles have always done. I think this is going to be a team more committed to running the ball than the first two opponents that Oregon has faced, because Kalani Sitake is a defensive head coach. And what do we know about defensive head coaches? They always want to be able to run the ball. It's pretty rare that you see a defensive head coach who wants to throw it, 45 to 50 times a game. Jake Dickert at Washington State, Oregon's next opponent here in about 8 days from now, might be a lone exception to that particular rule. But from a competitive standpoint and a recruiting and talent standpoint, I don't feel that there's a big gap here between Oregon and BYU. In theory, if you're just going off recruiting rankings, yeah, the Ducks should have more talent on their roster, but I watched BYU go toe-to-toe with Baylor, and I don't feel that this is a team that Oregon is going to be able to out-physical. I feel like it's a team where they're going to have to match that physicality level on both sides of the ball if they're going to have a chance to win.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I do think that Oregon's got a more talented roster than BYU, but they also have a more talented roster than Baylor. But there's coaching and there's development and there's fit and there's a lot of components that weigh into from the time that each individual player signed to the entire entity of an entire roster working together to play a football game. So the talent's extremely important, and it's the most important aspect of it all. But we've got certainly tons of examples across college football of coaching and development that raise composite number 35 rosters up to play with top 10 or 12 teams in the country. To play with the top 3 or 4, that's a whole other thing. But to play with the top 10 or 15, yes, we see prime examples of that. We just saw, as you mentioned, next week's opponent, Washington State, goes out to Wisconsin. It's the first game that Wisconsin's blown. 78-0 when they've posted over 400 yards of total offense and limited the opposition to under 300. That's exactly what they
Wow.
did do. But they lost the game. They fumbled the ball in the red zone in the final 5 minutes and never got it back. So Wazoo pulled that off as, wherever they rank in recruiting rankings. And that's not the best analogy because Wisconsin doesn't recruit at that high of a level. But we know what we thought the difference was there and what Vegas thought the difference was there. And man, week 2 was crazy with those kind of examples: App State, Texas A&M, Marshall, Notre Dame, and Georgia Southern, Nebraska. So we've got 4 prime examples of how that gap can be, and the gap doesn't even exist between these two teams. So yeah, the talent difference, whatever that is, I don't think is consequential. Maybe long term in terms of building a program and winning and going for championships, but on Saturday in Eugene, no.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. Finally, Mark, what do you think is the most important piece of this game that'll determine the outcome, and what's your prediction?
Oh, okay. Well, turnovers are always the place to go to. So we don't want to be generic there, but that turnovers and special teams, blocked field goals, etc., blocked punts, those are just become 80-85% certainties for the team that are able to pull off those kind of special plays. Uh, you know, Bo Nix and his receiving core, the 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 timing, the ability to make plays, and for him to play within himself and not get outside of what the game plan should be and what it is, to still play loose and free and work to his capabilities, which is getting outside the pocket and making plays with his legs, but not throwing the ball in harm's way. I think Bo Nix is probably the biggest factor in this game.
You got a
Prediction?
score prediction?
I got no prediction for you. I make those on Patreon, and I usually make them late Friday night. I really don't have anything for you. I do agree with your take that on the surface, and I'm no handicapper, no odds maker, but I talk to a few each week, and that 3.5 scares me away from taking Oregon necessarily against the spread. While I'm leaning Oregon straight up, I do think that this could be, and we've already seen a number of outcomes in college football this season where the favorites won the game, but it's been that tight, that close, i.e., Utah, Florida, and a few others come to mind, that it pretty much played out as expected and would have been Baylor and BYU, but they just happened to go to overtime, so the spread was covered, but in overtime. That it could be that 3.5, that three number pushing to 3.5 is a key number, of course, in football. It's the most key number for betting odds, and that could come into play again Saturday.
Well, I think Oregon fans would take a win whether or not it's a cover by 1. I'm sure we'd all take it by 20 as well, but that probably seems unlikely. Mark Rogers, voice of college football on YouTube at Mark Rogers TV. Appreciate the insight and looking forward to another great weekend of college football.
Thanks, Spencer. I appreciate it.
I appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.